Sing my tongue the Savior's glory, of his flesh the mystery seen.
Of the blood all the price exceeding, shed by our
Hello and welcome to this week's installment of my series on Eucharistic Amazement that I've been doing most every week since this summer. I plan to do about 52 sessions of these, and whatever number we're on, I've lost track. And this week I am talking about this is my final one on Pope Francis's document on the liturgy that came out recently. Desiderio Desideravi does not roll off the tongue easily. And this is the final one on that. And this one might be of less interest to folks because he really the letter talks a lot about the priest and the seminary formation and how seminarians should be formed and how people should be formed about celebrating the liturgy with art and recognizing that no one in this that's watching these videos probably has either been to the seminary or is a priest. These are more for me, but if you'd like to see a little bit of behind the scenes of what it means to celebrate, well, maybe this episode is for you. So Pope Francis, last week I was talking about the Ars Celebrandi, the way of celebrating the liturgy. It is an art. There is an art to celebrating well the liturgy. And last week I was talking about how he was talking about, we often think of the presider or the priest as he celebrates the Mass, but really all the community celebrates the Mass. You know, sometimes people talked about you shouldn't ask like who's celebrating the Mass because, well, we all are, right? Or maybe it's better to ask who's presiding or at the Mass. And if someone says who's saying the Mass, well, you don't say the Mass, you celebrate the Mass. So how do you ask that question? What priest is going to be sitting in that chair this Mass? And it's always, of course, the priest is standing in place of Jesus Christ, the high priest. So we have a role to play, and it's an important role, but it's not the definitive role. But Pope Francis does say in this document, Desiderio Desideravi, he says in paragraph number 54, he says, in visiting Christian communities, I have noticed that their way of living liturgical celebration is conditioned, for better or unfortunately for worse, by the way in which their pastor presides in the assembly. So I do recognize that as a priest and as I celebrate the Mass, I am forming people just by the way that I celebrate the Mass. And I do try to be mindful of that. And different priests have different styles. That's true. And they emphasize different things. You know, I am a Vatican II priest through and through. I've only been to a Latin Mass a couple times. I haven't really experienced that much. And there is the criticism of, you know, the Mass before the reform of the Second Vatican Council. There was the opportunity to celebrate Mass facing the people, right? And I think that's a good thing. And I'm not by any means suggesting that we go back to the old way. However, so hold on, so keep that in mind. But let's just take a moment to recognize that one of the gifts that is brought when the Mass is celebrated, what they call ad orientem. People talk about the priest with the back to the people. It's not actually the best way to think of it. It's actually better to think of with everyone facing God together. That's the idea, right? It's not so much the priest with the back to the people, but everyone standing there and celebrating with God together. The advantage of that way of celebrating Mass is that styles, you don't tend to notice styles as much, right? Because you can only see the back, right? And there's less of a difference from priest to priest, and you get a more of a consistency throughout the celebration of the Mass. So there is that advantage. And the other advantage that I will mention of that way of celebrating Mass, and I think about this often, you might notice at the end of Mass, sometimes I come and I stand and I sing for quite some time the closing hymn. And to be quite honest, I love coming down, being with the people, and singing together to God. You know, we're all looking up at the screen, or I've got my book in front of me, and we're all singing to God. That's the idea of celebrating the Mass facing God together. And I like the idea of we're all like standing there holding hands, figuratively, I suppose, but standing there presenting all of our needs to God. And as the priest, I'm kind of, come on, guys, we're leading the way, and we're singing and praising God in one direction. It does make sense that way. But I mean, I have only on one or two occasions ever celebrated Mass in that way of facing the altar, because there was a couple times at the altar. Well, that was the only altar. It was like facing the wall. That's the only option I had. So, but anyway, there is that advantage of that. So, but what Pope Francis goes on to say is that in the way that Mass is celebrated, he says, here is a possible list of approaches, and we're still in paragraph 54. Even though we're opposed to each other, characterize a way of presiding that is certainly inadequate. You've got a rigid austerity or an exasperating creativity, a spiritualizing mysticism or a practical functionalism, a rush briskness or an overemphasized slowness, a sloppy carelessness or an excessive finickiness, a superabundant friendliness, or a priestly impassibility. I like the ways that he kind of sets those kinds of things, if that's the way that sometimes Mass is seen. And what Pope Francis is saying is neither of those extremes are good. A superabundant friendliness is not good, but nor is a priestly impassibility. Now, I know the ways that I would err, I suppose. I tend to err, I suppose. My style tends to be priestly friendliness or whatever, where another priest might not have that kind of thing. I tend to be pretty expressive, and I want to welcome everyone into the presence of God and into the celebration. But I do try to be mindful of the things that I don't want to get too far over on there, that we've lost all sense of like reverence, and that we are lifting things up to God. And so there's always that fine line to walk. The Mass should look effortless. It shouldn't look like I am just trying to follow all the rules and make sure I get everything done. I want to get everything done, but not look like I'm getting everything done. I'll use that piano player analogy again, right? A reasonably good piano player can go and hit all the notes and be in time and everything, but there's no grace to it. There's no art to it. There's no expressiveness to it. And a beautiful piano player takes the notes, plays the notes, but plays them with expression and knows how to play between the notes and everything. And it's beautiful. That's what distinguishes an excellent piano player from a very functional piano player that gets the job done but isn't particularly beautiful or uplifting. I think for the art of celebrating, that's the goal that I strive for, is do the things, but don't look like I'm doing the things. Don't bring attention to those things. Do the things naturally. That's always the goal, at least for me. It talks about improvisation, and there was, I think sometimes people lament that there's not as much creativity and improvisation or whatever in the Mass as maybe there was in the 1970s, 1980s. I talked to some of the older priests, and they said it's such an exciting time. They could experiment and try new things and everything. And there's less experimentation going on. That's for sure. And there are times that call for creativity and experimentation. In the book, it says when I can say these words or I can say similar words. And to be honest, in the missal that came out in 2011 or whatever that was, there were fewer opportunities given for this or similar words. There were more, you say these words. And so I try to be obedient to what I'm supposed to say. If these are the words I'm supposed to say, I'm going to say those words. And there is a value in that, because the Mass, it is ritual, right? It is a celebration. And if I improvise and be creative, I am actually limiting your ability to pray and to respond, right? I used to be an actor, and it's important that as an actor, you say your lines the way that they are said, so you help the next actor say their lines, and you respond. You have this back and forth. And there is some room for improvisation in the theater, but if you improvise too much, you throw off the other actor, and then they can't respond, and that doesn't help the show at all. So you're supposed to say the lines the way they are supposed to be said. Similarly, in the Mass, I say the line, I say, "The Lord be with you," and you say, "and with your spirit." If I improvise that, I'm throwing off your rhythm. If I say, "The Lord, who is the great King of everything, and be with you, and with your spirit, and lift up all the energies that you have in your hearts, and be glorified to God," and then what's your response, and how do you respond to that? So it is important so that we engage and we have a beautiful interaction. The Mass is meant to be interactive. It's actually more interactive if you say the proper lines and you do what is said, so that you have a give and take between the priest and the community. So those are the things that I try to keep in mind, that I want to have a rhythm to the Mass so that you can respond and respond well. One of my main things is that, and Pope Francis talks about that all the time in this document, is the full, active, conscious participation of the people. I want to facilitate and enable that. So those are kind of some of my principles. I always want to engage the people. I want to make sure that I am not being too friendly or too solemn or whatever. It's a mix of the both. And I also try to be attentive as to where I am talking. The Eucharistic prayer, it's offered to God, right? Not to the people. So if I don't look at you during the Eucharistic prayer, well, there's a reason, because quite frankly, I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to God, and I'm bringing everyone else's prayers up with the prayers that I say, bringing those up with God. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to God, and you are listening to the words that I've been given to say. So I try to be attentive. If I'm talking to you, I try to be attentive to where I'm talking. If I'm talking to God, I'm not looking at you. I'm kind of trying to look up to God. So I try to keep all those things in mind, and I try to celebrate well the Mass. Not just playing the notes, not just doing the rubrics, but doing those and incorporating them and making them incarnate in the person that I am, imperfect that I am, to try to hopefully bring people to an encounter with Jesus Christ. But it takes years of practice. It takes years of trying to refine the craft, and I try to get better, and hopefully I can continue to improve on what's the best way to help people lift them up to God, to encounter Jesus in the Eucharist, especially through the Mass. So just some of my thoughts of what I do in my Ars Celebrandi, the art of celebrating. Those are kind of things that I try to weigh and go through my head as I celebrate the Mass. So next week we'll do something else, some more Eucharistic talk. So thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Tantum ergo sacramentum. Tantum ergo sacramentum.